This is Voluminous, a listening books podcast for every kind of reader, but especially for fans of audiobooks. Each month during this series, we take a different theme and do one Roundup episode and one deep dive. This month, we're all about books that are even better as audiobooks than in their traditional printed format. And here with me today to round up some worthy titles and then play a good-natured game at the end are Sarah Matthews. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
And Andrew Bell. Hello, Andrew.
Hello.
And welcome to the show, both of you. I believe this is a first-time appearance for each of you. Is that right?
It is.
Yep.
I am delighted to have you. And up to now, I think that these Roundup episodes have been a chance for the listening book staff to talk up books they've enjoyed. But the two of you are what I've been calling staff adjacent. Still very much a part of the listening books family, but I'm going to let each of you tell us exactly how you're connected. Sarah, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So I work as an admin volunteer as support for Claire Bell. I do a lot of work on background research on internet websites, and also I do some transcribing of interviews as well.
Excellent. That's such important work. And what about you, Andrew?
So yeah, Claire Bell is my wife, so I know listening books from that, but I'm also lucky enough to be a listening book subscriber.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, that's a twofer there. Lovely to hear that Claire Bell is such a common denominator as well. She's present even when she's not here in the studio. And the other thing that I'd love to know is something about the relationship that you each have with audiobooks and what sort of role they play in your lives. Sarah, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I've always enjoyed listening to audiobooks, but about 6-7 years ago I lost my sight, and having had sight for so many years, it was obviously a massive blow. I spent a bit of time in hospital, and audiobooks were very much a comfort and way to escape from that world, and obviously I've carried on listening to them since.
Gosh. And what about you, Andrew?
Yeah, I came to audiobooks quite late. I've always been a lover of reading, but when I went into hospital, and I've spent time in hospital and kind of been at home, been very ill, I found audiobooks were great when I didn't have the energy to read.
I think it's great to talk audiobooks with people for whom it's played such an important role. I think I came to audiobooks just as another alternative in my reading life, and they've certainly added to my reading life. But I haven't been listening to them for a long enough time to sort of know who the best narrators are, or who publishes the best audiobooks, or to have as many strong opinions about them. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the recommendations that you've brought with you today, because I'm definitely going to be looking them up and listening to some of them. I took the notes that you each gave me, and I thought I saw a few patterns emerging. So I took the liberty of coming up with a few categories to help us organize the conversation, because I saw a few things that kept appearing in terms of why this particular book was so much better as an audiobook than as a printed version. And the first of those categories is books where the author is the one who narrates. And I suppose where that is most obviously an advantage is with autobiographies. And Andrew, I'm gonna let you take that cue and tell us about the first one on your list.
Okay, I love reading autobiographies, and I found this autobiography on Listening Books. It was called Being Jazz, My Life as a Transgender Teen by Jennings. Now, I believe Jazz is a well-known TV personality and is quite famous for this, but I've never heard of her before this autobiography. In the book, she's very precocious and she's very self-assured, and in the written book, that can be hard to decipher. Some passages can come across as a little, perhaps arrogant, and the fact she narrates this book in the audiobook, she softens it. She humanizes the entire book. You really understand where she's coming from, and how much this means to her, how personal this is, and how much she is trying to be an advocate for the whole community. And it makes the book so much better.
I was just thinking of every email or text where I have wondered if I should take offense because I could not tell what sort of tone of voice they would have said that in if they were saying it to my face, because the message definitely differs. I think anybody can see how having somebody's voice add that sort of warmth and friendliness to some text that, because it has so much personality and so much attitude, could maybe read as less friendly.
Especially when the author is not from the UK. For example, she's American, and Americans have different standards to what they consider polite or firm responses. And that can really confuse us. Especially, I work for a multinational company, and sometimes I can think a response is exceptionally rude, and it's just found out it's just how the Americans write an email.
Right. Well, I'm going to be ultra careful for this episode. Believe me, if I say something that comes across as rude, it is not intentional. And since you have experience of both, maybe you could just flag it for me and say, Jessica, that's a very American way of expressing something.
Didn't say I was right. I just said that's how I felt.
Sarah, you had a few books in this sort of category as well, where the author is the narrator, and that really adds something to it. Do you want to tell us a few of those?
Yeah, of course. Mainly books written by comedians. I really enjoyed the Partridge, We Need to Talk About Alan autobiography, which is a spoof of the genre, and anyone who's ever seen any of Alan Partridge's stuff on TV or on radio will know that he's got a very particular style and character, and I think that book as a printed version would really have lost something for me reading it, whereas having it on audio, it's read by Steve Coogan and it's hilarious. He's just got the comic timing. He has that character down so well over the last 20 years or so, and it is really the perfect audiobook, I would say. I've listened to bits in and out when I've wanted to just drop in back and have a little read of it. It's like the sort of book you can go back to and rejoin just for a laugh.
Absolutely. And that strikes me as a sort of book that, I would listen to just to hear the delivery of a good line. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about, were there any others besides comedies or?
Yeah, there's also, it is written by a comedian, Sarah Pascoe, but the book is, it's more of like a memoir, but she's writing about sort of the female experience. The book's called Animal, The Anatomy of a Woman, and she does talk a lot about her own experience growing up in quite a sort of difficult childhood, and then how she's got through that and moved on with her career and had to go through some very difficult times. She doesn't shy away from very hard topics such as sexual consent and abortion, but she does it in such a way that you find that you really warm to her, and you also engage with what she's saying, even if your experience is completely different. And I think she's also added in quite a lot of sort of evolutionary biology kind of facts and stats as well in there, which are things that I've learnt a lot from, which is something a bit different. It's not a mix of kind of styles that I've come across before.
And can you imagine anybody else narrating that? Is it author specific?
Yeah, I think it really is. Yeah, because some of it is so very personal. I don't think anybody else would be able to sort of get that sort of emotion across. Yeah. And I think reading that as a print version, I don't think it would be anywhere near as enjoyable.
Yeah, I would say the same about Michelle Obama's Becoming. And of course, anybody would laugh at the idea of anybody else reading that. It would have to be Michelle Obama. But I made sure to read that book as an audiobook because I wanted her in the room with me. And that's the feeling of an audiobook. I wanted to feel like I was in her company again. And it was really special. I feel like we could be friends now.
I've never listened to an audiobook from a politician or someone that important. Did she make you feel welcoming in the audiobook? Is that a bad word to say? Is it?
No, that's not a bad way to say. She definitely did. She sounded really approachable, not like she was sort of reading from on high or anything, and just it really did sound like she was talking to one person. You.
Cool.
Yeah, it was really personal. She has this one section in particular that made me cry while I was cooking dinner, which is often when I'm listening to audiobooks or podcasts. I'm usually puttering around in the kitchen, and I got very weepy when she was describing the day that her father died, which, parental bereavement, that's always going to be a sad topic, but the scene when they said goodbye to each other at the hospital was actually just so tender and so beautiful and so desperately sad that I'm tearing up now as I recall it. But yeah, I absolutely recommend getting the audiobook for that particular book. By far superior to reading just the text. Sarah, you had another one that you mentioned. Was it James? Is it Laycaster?
James Laycaster, yeah. Now, this book is one that I came to because I was listening to a radio show years ago, which was actually Josh Widdicombe's show. Josh Widdicombe did a show on radio every Saturday afternoon, and he's mates, obviously, with a lot of comedians, and he would just ask James Laycaster to pop in every now and again, and he would tell a story out of his life. And he seems to come across the most ridiculous situations in his life, and so he would tell an anecdote, and that then grew into them being called Classic Scrapes, and then it became a book. So it's James Laycaster's Classic Scrapes, and he sort of takes you on a trip through his life from when he was about sort of 7 or 8 years old, and he told his class teacher that he would be quite happy to get in front of the class and show everybody how to do juggling when he didn't even know what juggling was.
What?
And it's just ridiculous things. Like somehow he's one of those people that just can't help but get into the most ridiculous situations. Like, I think there was another one later down in his career where he obviously is a comedian and travels around the country going to all kinds of different venues, and one night he was trying to get home but he missed the last train, and he ended up sleeping under a hedge covered in somebody's coat or something, and just loads of ridiculous things like that, which just make you smile. And he's also got a particular way of delivering these anecdotes that just it just brightens up your day, really. And again, it's sort of like when I'm listening to these things around my house, it's sort of like having a friend or a bit of company there. I don't feel like I'm sort of wandering around on my own. And that's what I like about it, that kind of sort of conversational manner.
Yeah. That one reminds me of another person. I feel like I've probably mentioned him on this podcast before, so forgive me, listeners, if this is old news and you want me to move on. But that reminds me of David Sedaris, who listeners might be familiar with him because he's been on BBC Radio 4 quite a bit. There's been a series with him. He writes personal essays, but what kind of really got his, I won't say it didn't start his career, but what really, I suppose, gave him his first big push as an author was getting to read his personal essays on an American radio show called This American Life decades ago, and it really gave a much wider audience to his very unique way of writing about his personal life and observations, and his sort of knack for noticing the odd human behavior around him. And the thing about him is that I don't think you would necessarily ask him to narrate any sort of other kind of book, because his voice and accent, so he's from North Carolina and I'm from South Carolina, so I feel some affinity for him that way as well. But he has a very, very distinctive accent and way of talking that is so well suited to his material and his personality, and it is just him. but it's so unmistakable. I don't think you'd ever want to transfer that necessarily, unless it was for a character much like him, you know.
You bring a good point, though, in that we all have accents and we're all from a certain place. But there's something about the southern states in the United States, the Carolinas, the Texas, all those states. When people from those states start talking stories and anecdotes, I don't know what it is about that accent or those accents, but they just wrap you in the story and they bring you in a bit more. I don't know. I've worked with people from Texas, from Carolina, from some of the northern states, and and like I said, from the southern states, when those people start telling you anecdotes, to me, I could just sit there all day, like be in a bar with them and listen to those stories. They just add something, and that's what we're talking about with these audiobooks. For me, whether it's something really funny like these comedians' books or something really personal, it heightens the emotion. I do a lot of listening to audiobooks on the train in, and I've got to be careful because I've been flying while listening to audiobooks, and I've laughed out loud. And of course, you've got headphones in, you're kind of wrapped up in the story, and like you said, you feel like the person's talking to you.
Yeah.
And you forget your surroundings.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And it could be laughing or it could be crying.
Right, yeah.
Either way, it can be hard sometimes just to keep a lid on the emotion while you're on public transport. Not that there's anything wrong with being publicly emotional, just, you know, you don't necessarily want to invite questions about your emotional or mental state, really.
If you want to see how good British people are at ignoring each other on a train, start crying. We'll have 50 strangers looking the other way.
Oh man, I have some stories, but they are not suitable for this podcast. I want to move on to another category, unless either of you had any other titles that you wanted to add to this particular one. Sarah, did you have others that you wanted to mention?
No, I think that's covered it.
Okay, all right. I'm going to move on to the category of when a text has the potential to be confusing or hard to get into. And in that scenario, the audiobook is actually better. Andrew, you have one on your list that I'm really intrigued by once I looked it up. It's the Matt Haig book. Do you want to tell us about that? Notes on a Nervous Planet?
Yeah, I picked this book. Not only is the audiobook itself very good, but I wanted to pick it as a representation of the whole category. Self-help or productivity books. I've had to read a few over the years, and I find them deadly dull, or the worst of both worlds, where they try and weave in a personal story at the same time as trying to teach you techniques. And what is it? Is it a biography? Is it an autobiography? Or is it a technique and self-help book? This one in particular is really good. Last year I was at a different company, and this company was going through some really bad times. And several employees, I mean half the office we're talking about, kind of got anxiety or high stress levels from this, and we're each trying to deal with it in different ways. And I looked at this book and a couple of others just to learn a bit more about how Matt Haig relaxed from this onslaught of technology and onslaught of news, being connected to the World Wide Web the whole time. And I found the book hard to get into. I kind of wanted to quickly skip ahead and find the answers. And I found some of his writing, or I found while he was talking about himself, I didn't want to know about it at the time. I didn't feel like I was connecting with him. But in the audiobook, like we said before, you know, the fact it was him speaking, he can put that extra emotion in. He can make you feel like, oh, actually, I can understand, I can relate to him. And you can get through those parts of the books which are the autobiographical parts. Easy for me to say.
It's a lot of syllables.
Yes. And then you can still take the time to listen to him as he's going through how the techniques he's built and take those on board whilst reading the book. But it's not just about his book. It's about all those books in the sector in that category.
So forgive me for maybe not quite
Did that
getting
not make
this.
sense?
No, it totally made sense. But what is it about listening to it that makes it easier to get through?
That's a good question, and I perhaps should have started with that. If you've got high levels of anxiety, it's amazing what everyday tasks can suddenly become really stressful. You can take a look at a book, and a book will be this tangible thing. It'll be several hundred pages, and you're like, I don't have the energy. I don't have the calmness to read. Yeah, I don't even have the calmness to segment it into 30 pages a day. And it becomes like yet another obstacle. And by having an audiobook, and you don't have to look at the timer, it's just there listening while you do something else, you can relax and get into it, and suddenly it starts to make sense.
Yeah, that does make sense to me. Yes. Sorry, when I asked it, I just realized that you possibly had already answered my question and that I hadn't been listening attentively enough, which is, absolutely a possible thing to happen.
Oh, no.
But yes, so thank you for answering so graciously. And I want to read that book, or listen. I want to read the audiobook in particular. Now that you've given that boost, but when I looked it up just so I could see something about it, I saw in the description these 3 questions that it is supposed to answer. How can we stay sane on a planet that makes us mad? How do we stay human in a technological world? And how do we feel happy when we are encouraged to be anxious? And I responded so well to those questions because, they seem so pertinent. I just cannot imagine these questions not being relevant to someone in today's world. Quite a lot of what I've been listening to lately on a podcast and articles that I've read are about how our social media and the information the information world that we live in is kind of, it's not that anybody is maliciously designing it as such, but it just the way that the information economy works, it ends up making us more anxious. It actually feeds on this sort of outsized emotions, outrage and that sort of thing. It feeds on that, and because that's what gets more clicks and that's what gets more eyes, and so there are things the individual can do, I suppose, to take control over their environment and which social media tools they use and that sort of thing. But we're kind of living in a saturated world with that right now.
And he actually starts out, the first chapter of the book is talking about how he's in this absolute rage state. He's on his phone having a Twitter argument or having an argument online. And his wife's going, "Are you okay? You've just walked into furniture." And he's saying how he hasn't actually looked up from his phone for an entire hour. He's been pacing the flat and he's in this complete stress state.
Yeah.
And
it's like that XKCD cartoon. Someone is wrong on the internet.
Right. And
so true.
He's talking about how if social media in small bits or the online world in small hits is feeding that dopamine hit that we all crave and can seem like, this is really enjoyable. And you do more and more of it and you become oversaturated, like you say. And it's some of the stuff he's talking about makes sense in isolation. You're like, kind of come off the internet for a bit a day and stuff like that. But it's amazing how hard that can be with all our friends on WhatsApp and people on Twitter, and you spend all day on it very easily. I found that book. I work in the technology sector, so being on a computer, being online for 12, 13 hours a day is not abnormal. And it's how do you isolate yourself from that? And going into social media, like those echo chambers, people can just easily get really wound up from people saying what you kind of want to hear, and everyone just kind of repeating it. And if you're really involved in the environment and you read online all day about how the earth is kind of really at real danger, you could stress yourself out and become completely paranoid about everything.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think Matt Haig is someone I follow on Twitter and found him really interesting. I haven't actually read any of his books yet. That's definitely one I'm gonna look up, because he does deal with those kind of Twitter things very well.
Yes.
He diffuses arguments.
Oh, rather than escalating them. How refreshing.
Yes. Yeah. How unusual on the online
world. Every now and
world.
again, he'll just tweet out like a really encouraging statement that people can just feel more positive about themselves and about their day, just by reading his little tweets. He's like, I just like the way he uses the Twitter platform.
Yeah.
Yes.
I will say another advantage to listening to the self-help category on audiobooks is if we're reading on public transport, it is nice to know, because not every self-help book has such a nice neutral sort of title as Notes on a Nervous Planet. Some of them sound a little bit more self-helpy, and while there shouldn't be any sort of stigma attached to self-help books, I think sometimes there probably is. And even if there isn't, you just mightn't want people reading into the sort of book that you're reading, sort of saying, oh, well, she must be insecure because, that sort of thing. It's sort of nice to know that whatever you're listening to, nobody else can sort of read over your shoulder.
Well, talking of online stuff, you remember when Harry Potter books were coming out? Adults were reading them on the train, and you'd find in some parts of the online community absolute ridicule and scorn that adults would be reading Harry Potter books. And so, like, audiobooks of any kind, you can listen to them and no one knows what you're listening to.
Yes.
And I think that's great.
Absolutely.
Because I still love Harry Potter books, may I just add.
Oh yeah. Yeah, me too, yeah.
Who doesn't?
Definitely. You're in good company here.
Excellent.
Amongst friends. Sarah, you had a couple, not necessarily in the self-help thing, but in the idea that a text alone, where a text alone might be a bit confusing, that it is perhaps less so because of the audiobook format. I think you mentioned The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that is a book that I've liked the look of for many years, but never really got to read because it's intimidatingly long. It's about 600 pages, which is far longer than anything I would normally attempt. And I'd also, heard that it can be quite difficult. I'd read Norwegian Wood years ago and enjoyed that. And you just never really got round to reading this one. So when I found it on audio, I thought, right, I'm going to give this a go. And do you know what? The narrator on it is amazing. And when I came to do this podcast to think about it, I went back to find that audio recording and realised, because in my head I thought that there were lots of different actors doing the parts, because there's characters from, like a teenage girl, Mei Kasahara, to a very old war veteran, and these are all done by one actor. So I was quite amazed by that. And when I got into the book, I found that I was able to reread bits that I didn't quite understand and go back to it quite easily, which I think I would find a bit harder trying to do in a print book. And also the story it starts off quite accessible, really, because it's about a character called Toru who has just given up his job. He's living in Tokyo. His wife is an editor in a magazine. She's very busy. She's out and about all day. He's at home doing the laundry and doing the cooking. And one day the cat goes missing, and his wife asks him to go find the cat. So he starts on this adventure trying to find this cat.
Okay, wait. Is the cat okay by the end of the book? I need to know this.
Yeah, me too.
Do you know what? This is one of the things that's quite tricky about this book, is that the sort of the characters, they drop in and then disappear and then come back again. So that I don't think I really want to say.
Okay.
Just because it is. Yeah, it's sort of
fair enough. In my head, the cat is okay.
The cat will be fine. Yeah.
As someone who absolutely adores cats, I'm not going to read it if the cat is in any way, shape or form harmed.
Yeah. Again, in good company here.
Yeah.
I think the cat is more of a symbol anyway. But yeah, so it starts off this way, and but then it turns very sort of surreal sort of corner where he sort of goes over the fence to try and find the cat, and then walks past the garden, and there's this young girl sunbathing in the back garden, and he ends up sort of chatting to her and talking to her, and he's sort of like saying, I don't really have anything to do with my day, and she's like, oh well, you can come join me on my job. She's meant to be at school, but she's not. And her job is to go to an area in Tokyo that's quite built up and count the men that walk by who are bald. And so he goes off with her and does this job for a day. And so it's sort of this story meanders.
I want to see the application for this job.
That's amazing.
It's quite a funny sort of moment. But then, so things change where, some of the story is about the fact that of what happens when a couple don't communicate. So Tora and his wife, they sort of stop talking properly to each other and become sort of isolated from each other's lives. And then I don't want to give away too much of the story, but things move on, and then things happen in his life which become a little bit sort of surreal and magical, and he spends some time. There's a character who is a war veteran, and there's a whole section in the book which is told from his standpoint and sort of narrated in a voice of a very old Japanese man, and he's talking about the Battle of Manchuria in the Second World War, and that is very sort of heavy and difficult. And then there's all these other elements that are sort of light and funny, and I think in some ways it gets described as sort of magical realism.
Yeah,
and I guess that I would agree with that, but I also think it's could almost be a sort of comment on somebody sort of having a breakdown as well, because I think a lot of the sequences are sort of like dreamlike sequences, or like he's getting lost in his head. There are lots of symbols such as wells. He gets sort of stuck down a well, and there's this sort of strange sort of mystery as well, where there's the wind-up bird, which is obviously the title of the book, comes from this bird that's in a back garden of one of the houses nearby where he lives. But this house is sort of cursed, and everyone that's lived there has sort of died a terrible death. And that is also another strand of the story. So there's a huge amount going on in this book. As you can imagine, it can get quite confusing and difficult to keep up with. And I think if I was attempting to read this in print, I would have given up pretty quickly. But because I was able to read it in sections and sort of, go back and reread bits and try and sort of work it out as I could in my head, I don't know that I really understand it. I'd probably need to listen to it all over again. But it stayed with me, I think. Like there's parts of that book that really, that is really quite moving and also just hugely entertaining as well.
Did it have different narrators for the different?
It didn't. No, it's one narrator. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Rupert Degar is the name.
Okay.
And it was surprising when I come back to it to find that he did all the voices. Just brilliant acting.
Amazing. I would add to this category basically any of those massive classics that we're all supposed to have some familiarity with, but mightn't want to tote around and do the painful sort of read. I know I'd never have got beyond about 300 pages of James Joyce's Ulysses. So.
Has anyone?
My father-in-law,
wow.
who will speak up for it, and actually, I mean, he says, the chapters, which really aren't chapters, they're episodes, that you should be able to sort of, they are in some senses self-contained, so you should be able to sort of pick up one and read just that episode, and then.
So you can treat it like a podcast.
Yes, maybe, yes. Episode 1. No, but I do think because that book, as well as Finnegan's Wake, relies so much on sound, like for you to know, certainly, so I haven't read any of Finnegan's Wake, so I'm just going to talk about Ulysses, really. But certainly Ulysses relies so much on the sound of what a person in Dublin would talk like in that era, and I think you don't necessarily. I think it's much harder to decode without somebody performing that.
Right.
It is. I've heard somebody do a monologue that is a sort of an abridged version of it, and it's brilliant to listen to. And it's actually, I mean, it's one of these books that, even though it has really high prestige, just because it's difficult, it's actually a lot like Shakespeare. It's very bawdy and, full of lots of sort of dirty jokes and things. So it's actually.
Is it very poetic? Is that part of the reason why it's
well,
sort of tricky?
Yeah, some of it is. But the thing is that each chapter, each episode is written in a completely different style. And some of it is harder to decipher than others. But I think it's definitely one that is better listened to. And I've been told that by the people who study it as well.
Oh, wow.
Yes, it's better to listen to it. And I'm going to throw in Moby Dick, Herman Melville's big tome as well, because I'm pretty certain that, I mean, just based on what I'm interested in, that I am going to tune out during the minutiae of wails and wailing that I have heard are in the book, and I may as well be able to get something done while I tune out.
I've never been able to finish that book.
Oh, really? Have you started it?
Started it, just
Right.
give up. I'm going to try the audiobook.
Too much.
Yeah, definitely. I think we try the audiobook, and I should look up actually and see what versions, how many times it's been done, because it'd be interesting to see who's performed it and, what sort of difference that makes. Sarah, I think you also had a couple of Kazuo Ishiguro books in this category, did you?
Yeah, absolutely. I listened to quite a number of his books on audio. Started with The Remains of the Day, which of course is wonderful. All of his books seem to be completely different styles. So I'd heard from a number of people recommendation of Never Let Me Go. And so I thought, okay, I'll give this one a go and put it on. Completely different style, obviously, and it's narrated by a schoolgirl, and she's in a school somewhere in a countryside, possibly in East Anglia, which is very isolated. It's like a boarding school, and it's narrated with her friends Ruth and Tommy, I believe their names are, and she talks in a way that it seems a little bit sort of alien, and there's a lot of phrases in it and you think, I don't understand what that means, and of course he doesn't help you there. You have to just work it out as you go along, which is brilliant. And I'm so glad I went to this book without having read any reviews of it, because I think there would have been no way that someone wouldn't have given away a clue, and that's why I don't want to say too much about it, because I think everyone should go to that book without knowing anything about it whatsoever. It has been sort of categorised as a sort of sci-fi novel, but I didn't really see it that way at all. It's got some elements of that because there's a lot of, I guess, sort of dystopian future type outlook in it, but it's actually set in a kind of recent past in sort of the 1980s. So it's a book that kind of reveals itself as you go along, and you have to work things out. You can't be a lazy reader with that one.
Right.
And listening to it on audio was brilliant, because I did rewind and re-listen to several passages thinking, what did they just say, and how does that connect to what was just said a chapter or two ago? And I did find that really helpful.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I am going to have us crack on a bit, because we have one more category, and then I have a game that I really want us to play. So the last category is an audiobook is better than a traditional book when the performance is just that great. And Andrew, I think you've got a Terry Pratchett novel in this category.
Yes. Now, Terry Pratchett is my favourite author of all time. I've been reading him for about 25 years. I've read some of his books over 30 times.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and I've never listened to them on audiobook until the last couple of years. And I was so determined that the characters in my head, I had formed them just the way the author had envisaged, and I didn't want anything to disrupt that. And I was on a plane back from America one time, and I just needed something to listen to because I couldn't sleep. And I had Mort on audiobook.
That is such a great character.
It's fantastic. And Nigel Planer is the narrator for Mort. And in the book, Mort is this country lad who cannot get a job, and his father takes him down to the apprentice fair, and the death of Discworld is having a midlife crisis, if you can, and is looking for an apprentice and hires Mort. And Mort suddenly transforms from this real country bumpkin who can barely walk without tripping over his own feet to this really confident, Death's apprentice. And you're taking on this journey. And so obviously you've got all these wonderfully well fleshed out characters by Terry Pratchett. And Nigel Planer does this fantastic job of bringing each one to life in ways that I'd never picked up in the book. And I went from never wanting to listen to any of Terry Pratchett's stuff on audiobook to going, wow, actually I can listen to this. It adds something to the book.
Oh, wow. You couldn't get a stronger recommendation than that. That's brilliant. Sarah, you had one in this category called Generation A.
Yeah, sure. That's the Douglas Copeland book. And it's a book that I came to on audio. I didn't read it first. I'd read Generation X years and years ago, which came out in 91, and obviously sort of spawned the phrase that has been talked about ever since, and all the marketing that went with it. But this book is definitely only connected with that one word. It's a very different book to the original. Obviously, it's got the same wit and cynicism and sort of cutting humour that he's so famous for. Very sarcastic. It takes a very wry look at things like social media, how we live online all the time, YouTube, etc. And what makes it so great is there are 5 main characters in the story, and they're from all different parts of the world. So you've got someone in Sri Lanka, Australia, Canada, and France, and so they're all different narrators with their own accents, which makes it really unique, and each chapter is told from their point of view, so it jumps around quite a bit. And I think, as you know, like a physical book, that might be a bit difficult to hold those characters in your head as they keep sort of jumping about, whereas of course with the voice attached to each one, it's, I think, a lot easier to understand the structure of the novel. Anyway, the premise of it is that in these different parts of the world, each of these people gets stung by a bee. And the reason that is unusual is because in this sort of near future, there are no bees. They are extinct. There's been no bee sightings for about 5 years. And so basically some sort of government agents come in and gather up these 5 people and take them to some isolation centres and start doing some testing on them to find out, you know, what's going on. And then they get sent back into the world. But of course, everybody in the world now knows who they are. They're all instantly famous. And they all take to this in different ways. Some of them really excel. The American guy who he was a farmer at the beginning of the story, and he had a very dodgy online business where people could pay to watch him in his tractor naked as he went around. And he was one of those crazy people that would make obscene pictures in corn fields, crop circle type things. So it's kind of fun, but also it's got some serious points to make. Like there's in part of this story, there's a massive problem, obviously, with pollination if you've got no bees. So there's a huge crisis, and if you want to get fruit and veg, you have to go on the black market to get it. And there's also a massive problem with a drug called Solon, which crops up in each of these 5 characters' lives, and is another sort of big plot. And that sort of echoes also, the sort of opiate crisis going on in America. And it's interesting because this book's 10 years old, but it's very current, with what we've had recently with the climate activists and Greta Thunberg and all of that. And so it felt like it's actually quite a good time to revisit this book. And it's got some good points to make, but it's also hugely entertaining as well.
Yeah, I really love the premise. Immediately from the idea that you might get stung by a bee and it be like a miraculous thing rather than
something just annoying and painful.
Yeah, that's just ruined your day. There's one more book in this category, I think, and that one is one of yours, Andrew, an Agatha Christie novel.
Yes, The Body in the Library. I've read the book several times. It's a good book, but the audiobook I had from listening books is a full dramatization, a full cast dramatization, and kind of like what I was saying with the book Mort, the fact that it's a full cast and every character is played by a different actor really brings this book to life. And I think it does for a lot of the Agatha Christie's. Most of the books she's written are very much ensemble books, and when you read a book like that, you can sometimes fall into reading it as a narrator, or getting that approach of I'm looking at this from a third from a third person's angle. And with a full cast dramatisation or lots of actors, you can get drawn into it a bit more, and the characters come to life a bit, get more depth.
Excellent. Are you ready to play a game?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
We both look really worried.
This should go relatively quickly, if not painlessly. Right, I'm going to have to get my stopwatch out now because it's that sort of game.
Ooh.
Oh dear.
Yes. So a little bit different from the usual sort of thing. We don't need buzzers this time, which is good because I was really having trouble thinking of appropriate buzzer sounds to give to each of you. So no, what we're doing instead, I'm going to give you a category and 10 seconds on the clock. And when I say go, we're going to take this in turns, right? When I say go, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to name as many audiobook titles as you can that fit the category I've given you. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Suddenly feeling very silly and stupid right now. My mind goes blank. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I have chosen the categories somewhat at least based on what I know from your notes that you do read. So I don't think any of these should stump you. So we're going to do 3 rounds. So it isn't about winning each round so much as it is about the cumulative total that you get. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, who's feeling confident? Who would like to go first?
Ladies first.
Oh, no, I dropped it.
Okay, now, your category, Sarah, is audiobooks by Haruki Murakami. And go.
A Pale View of Hills. The Wind-Up... Oh, no, that's the wrong one. Haruki. Okay, I've got the wrong author already, haven't I? Okay.
Stop,
again.
sorry.
No,
Time's up.
I
I think you actually did get to you because you started to say the
I started
wind-up.
with the Ishiguro, didn't I? I
no.
got the
The Wind-Up Chronicles is
the
Haruki
Pale
Murakami.
View of Hills is Ishiguro.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know. I got confused.
That's grand. I'm going to give you one there.
I think
Okay.
we should do that again.
You might get a do-over. We'll see. I do feel like this first round might be a little unfair given what I've just heard from Andrew about his reading habits. Andrew, your category is audiobooks by Terry Pratchett.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Mort, Men at Arms, Guards, Masquerade, Night Watch.
Time. Okay, you did get 5. That's pretty amazing in 10
good.
seconds.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I do feel like this was slightly imbalanced
I was going to say.
given the canon of work that Terry Pratchett has, but
And I said it's my favourite author ever.
yeah. All right. Well, let's see if we can make up the difference, Sarah, in your category, your next category, I should say, which is audiobooks by comedians. And go.
Animal by Sarah Pascoe. I Ate Partridge by Anna Partridge.
Time.
Oh, I don't know.
It's horrible when your mind goes
Brain
blank.
doesn't work.
I know. I'm terrible at these. I'm terrible at timed things. If you give me time to think, I can come up with stuff. But all right. And Andrew, your category for this round is autobiographies and memoirs. And go.
My mind's gone blank as well. Being Jazz. Hell.
Time. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so far, Andrew's cumulative total is 6, and Sarah's cumulative total is 3, and we have one more round to go. So, Sarah, your category is audiobooks narrated by women.
Oh, okay.
Oh, go.
Sarah Pascoe, Animal. How to Be a Woman by what's her name? Moran. Moran. Oh, I give up.
Time. Okay. Got three's pretty decent. You think it's going to be easy with such a wide category, but it's actually harder.
You start to think of one, you freeze, and you go, I've only got 5 seconds left.
Okay. Andrew, your category for this round is audiobooks written by women. And go.
Oh my goodness. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. This is really embarrassing. Really embarrassing.
This is the thing. It's, again, like with such
So
a wide
hard.
category, it's actually harder. I don't know why that is, but I guess it's because you're having to dismiss so many more options
Yes.
possibly out of your head. All right, so let's do this final tally. Then,
I think it could be a tie.
yes,
Oh,
it's a tie.
it's
Well-
a miracle.
You get to share the glory then.
That's good.
Excellent.
I think that just shows all I listen to is Terry Pratchett and nothing else.
That's a good choice.
Well, congratulations to you both. And thank you both for all your excellent, well-considered recommendations and for making the time to be here. Sarah, I think you had one bonus recommendation. If you just want to quickly throw it out, this was a book that you wanted to re-listen to as soon as you'd finished it. And we don't have to talk about it. I just want you to give it as a bonus for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. I recommend it to anyone. It's The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton.
Excellent recommendation. And thanks also to our listeners. We would love to hear what you would add to our list of titles that are even better as audiobooks than in their traditional printed format. Let us know on Twitter or Instagram @listeningbooks, #voluminous, or podcast, whichever you find easier to spell. And you can also find us on Facebook with Listening Books 12. Can you believe the audacity of the first 11 listening books? If you're enjoying the show, one way to help us keep going is to spread the word. If you know someone else who might enjoy this podcast, maybe tell them about us. Or even better, send them a link. Voluminous is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity providing audiobooks for people with an illness, physical or learning disability, or mental health condition which affects their ability to read print or hold a book. If that's you or someone you know, you can find out how to access our more than 8,000 titles, including many of the ones we mentioned today, by heading to listening-books.org.uk.